Hello, I'm Lori Pace, and I'll be speaking on why diversity matters. My background is in urban planning and architecture, and I am now in real estate, where I am a speaker, a trainer, and a community activist. RESPECT. Find out what that means to me. We've heard the song before, but what does that really mean? We hear people talk about diversity and inclusion, and it's almost something that we hear people say in passing. It used to be really meaningful because it was a new concept, whereas now it's just a principle along with many other things that we talk about in school or the workplace. African American, Black, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, white, Caucasian. Words, again, that describe individuals, maybe even personalities. Being Black enough, being white enough, not Black enough, not white enough. These are things that students struggle with. Am I enough? When I first came to the United States from Jamaica, I couldn't wait to come to the United States. And I walked into a classroom so excited. And everybody was looking at me, and immediately I thought, fantastic, I'm the star. Then somebody came up to me and started rubbing my skin, and I thought, oh, that's lovely. And she asked the question, are you dirty? And I was shocked, and I wasn't understanding why. I wasn't offended. I just wanted to know why. Why did you ask that question? She had actually never been in a classroom with someone who was Black. In my case, when somebody said, no, she's Black, I said, last I checked, I was brown. But from there, I realized that I was different, but I was proud. It wasn't until later on in that day that I realized that being Black in the United States was negative. But that was one perspective of all the other kids in the class. And it wasn't going to change my thought of coming to this entire country to please just one. But then the next day I went back and I said, but why? What is it that you don't like? And after having many discussions throughout the day when I wasn't supposed to be talking, I realized that's just what he was taught. And it was through that I decided I'm on a mission to change that. So I worked really hard to do so with no success, until I realized there's other kids in the class who were excited for me to be there. Then there was this unique thing called an accent. I didn't know what it was called because this is what I sounded like. And people kept on saying, I want you to talk for me. Say something. I like how you say it. And I thought, this is great. Again, until somebody said, I don't understand what you're saying. Say it to me. And they'd say it louder. What are you saying? And no matter what I said, they didn't understand. So I went home and I begged my parents, I want to sound like an American. And they tried extremely hard. I would listen to tapes. I'd listen to music. We literally had recordings of vocabulary words to make sure that I sounded like an American. Little did I know later on in life that meant that I sounded white. My parents' goal was to make sure that I was the most educated I could be and be in the best environment. Was oftentimes, when I first came here, we were one of few African American, Black, Jamaican families. Call it what you are. I know we didn't look like everyone. Then one day, somebody finally said, where are you from? It was my proudest moment and my saddest day. My proudest moment because I realized that I was actually fitting in and I blended in. And nobody knew where I was from. But that's when I realized I had erased a part of my identity. Then I was confused because nobody knew what I was, who I was. They assumed I was African American, but I was actually from Jamaica. They assumed that I lived in neighborhoods where everyone looked like me, but I didn't. And then they would say things like, you're so articulate. And I remember when President Obama was told that, and there was this big uproar about it, and I thought, that's a common question that people say. Why do you sound like that? So when people talk about diversity and inclusion, it seems like it's almost the thing to do. In fact, some people would argue that there's a certain quota that you have to have when it's in a corporation. But in schools, there's no such thing. The only quota really is related to numbers, whether it's free and reduced lunch, whether it's immigrants, whether it's special help. These quotas mean something very different in schools than they do in America. That being said, each one of those individuals have a new perspective. Oftentimes in conversations, parents are very proud when they say, "My children don't see color." And that comes from a place of pride. But when you ask somebody who is of color, they want to be seen. Because the reality is that is the first thing that you see in me. Now, it could be the pretty eyes or the great smile or perhaps this wonderful personality. Or could it simply be is that's the first thing that you saw? And if so, that's something to be proud of. So when we have organizations that are AV, Jewish Alliance, Black Student Alliance, journalism, in a school where there's so many organizations, you think, is this helpful or hurting? What's the point of having individual organizations when we're one school? What's the point of having different groups when we're one corporation? The point being is sometimes there are days where you want to have a conversation with someone that looks like you, talks like you, or has the same strange sense of humor. Someone who understands that when we go to a dance, I can't believe they didn't play our music. Or someone who said, that was the best dance I ever had. They played all my favorite songs. Because we're made up of all of these things. So when you're asking questions out of curiosity, sometimes it turns into, I was just offended. So diversity, inclusion, really is a little bit of both. Some people don't even like the idea of having to talk about diversity because they feel they're living it. But it is important that we talk about it. Usually those conversations start with our leadership. When you lead by example, it becomes a safe place to have these discussions. When you have students who are afraid to say something because they're an immigrant or they just came to the school for the first time, but you have leadership that encourages others to approach you, to ask questions, embrace you, or just invite you to come and sit next to them at lunch. When you see somebody alone, you don't see them as lonely, you see that as an opportunity. It's about the way that you see things and not just what you hear. It's about taking chances. It's about talking to teachers, corporations, friends, family, and even your enemies. Oftentimes, that's where you learn the most. So when it comes to diversity and why it matters, the reason why it matters is because that represents who we are as a whole, collectively. But when you bring individuals together from different areas, from different ethnicities, that's when the learning begins. You can't learn from someone who's experienced the same thing you have. And you can't change an environment unless you change the culture, because we create a culture together. There are not individual cultures when you're in an environment together, but it has to be a safe place to be able to understand what our culture is. And the only way that happens is through continuous messaging. In social media, they call it how many likes you have. Marketing, they call it branding. Really all it is seeing it over and over and over again. It's never too much. In fact, when we start to feel comfortable, that's when we need to try harder, because that's when it's time to grow again. So there is no benchmark. There is no quota. There is no magic number. There aren't even specific questions every day. It might be a different question another day. The more that you're uncomfortable is when you grow. So it's sharing the gospel of knowing that uncomfortable is actually time to shine. This is when you find out somebody else's perspective. This is when you learn, and this is when at times you may be embarrassed, and times when you might look down and somebody taps on your shoulder and makes you look up. It's times when they say, do I call you Black, African American, Lori, Lisa? Do you spell it with an R? Do you spell it with an L? These are questions that begin conversations, because at the end of the day, it is relationships, connections, and trust. Because in real estate, for example, you have equity and you have trust. Those are both related to money. But when it comes to people, that's when we're talking about connections. But it is through equity that we learn from each other, because we have a goal in mind, is for people to feel as though they're a part of something. So that word diversity and inclusion, that we have consultants and specialists and books and magazines and articles and blogs and videos, they're not just words. Actions do speak louder than words. And we've all heard it. If you're not part of the problem and you're not part of the solution, you're not part of anything. But in order to be part of the solution, you have to recognize that the problem is an opportunity and the issue is where we start. That's not where we end. So when we are in a school that has so many people, and eventually it's in a university that has even more, or a corporation that has that much more, it does really start with you first, and in making sure that you bring someone else along to have the conversation, to figure out where do we go from here. So Aretha Franklin said it best as she sang RESPECT, but I challenge you to understand that it's through respect alone that change actually happens.